I know a lot of people are hoping that we'll have an opportunity to restore democracy at some point, perhaps once Trump is out of office, but unfortunately, it's looking more and more like competitive authoritarianism is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future, because there's so many things working against democracy right now. Right-wing oligarchs now own the most prominent media and social media companies in the country. They've also started to take control of voting machines. Just last week, Dominion Voting Systems was purchased by a Republican. And they're also gearing up to crack down even harder on their opposition. Here's what Scott Bessent and AG Pam Bondi said recently.
Just like we did with cartels, we're going to take the same approach, President Trump, with Antifa. Destroy the entire organization from top to bottom. And that's one of the things about Antifa. You've heard President Trump say multiple times, they are organized, they are a criminal organization, and they're very organized. You're seeing people out there with thousands of signs that all match, pre-bought, pre-put together. They're organized and someone is funding it. We're going to get to the funding of Antifa. We're going to get to the root of Antifa, and we are going to find and charge all of those people who are causing this chaos.
After 9/11, Treasury became the driving force behind tracking down the networks of terrorist organizations, how they were financed, how could this have happened on U.S. soil, with these international terrorist organizations. Where did the money come from? Who were the ultimate funders? And that was on the international side. And Andrew, I will tell you that Charlie's death is like a domestic 9/11. When you see these groups where all the signs match, they have hundreds of the same umbrellas that they're using. After they cause the mayhem, they have the same lasers that they're using to blind our police force. How are they constructed? Because this takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of organization, and we are going to do that. We have started to compile lists, put together networks, just as after 9/11 and Osama bin Laden, the ultimate culprit, was captured. We are operationalizing this here at Treasury, and we are going to track down who is responsible for this.
The reason why they're comparing anti-fascist protesters to the cartel and broadcasting their intent to go after them in the same way that they went after terrorist networks in the aftermath of 9/11 is because they want you to know to expect violence if you protest this regime. It's a threat. Organizing protests is not a crime. Having similar signs isn't a crime. It'd be like if Democrats went after the designer of the mass deportation signs that we saw last year at the RNC. My friend Andrea is designing signs for the No Kings protest that people can print themselves, and she's not getting paid for that. She's not being funded by George Soros. She's a graphic designer doing it out of the goodness of her heart because she cares about this country. This is in essence like the First Amendment and what it's supposed to protect, but they don't want us to have the right to criticize them, so they're going to straight up wage war on us, on American citizens. And what they're doing is going to foster a generation of Americans who are conditioned to stay quiet in order to avoid the wrath of the regime. I mean, these changes are going to have profound, long-term, damaging effects on this country, and they're not going to be easy to undo once Trump is out of power. And that's assuming that he's even planning to leave in the first place, because as Newsweek reports, Trump 2028 talks are ramping up among Republicans, with politicians like Randy Fine calling for the repeal of the 22nd Amendment, and operatives like Steve Bannon are basically admitting that they're going to try to find some way for Trump to essentially bypass the 22nd Amendment so he can run for a third term. But in addition to all of this, we now have to worry about another Supreme Court case that would be devastating. Louisiana v. Callais. And you might have already heard tidbits about this case because it centers around the Voting Rights Act, but I don't think people really grasp how devastating it would be if the Supreme Court rules in the way that they look like they're about to rule based on oral arguments that we just heard. To put it into perspective for you all, it wouldn't just pave the way for a return to Jim Crow, literally. It would lock in one-party rule for Republicans for at least a generation. And this is according to a report produced by Fair Fight Action and Black Voters Matter. Like, we are talking about political consequences that are so devastating, they would outlive the the Trump regime. And that right there is what I want to focus on in today's video. So what's in contention in particular is Section 2 specifically of the Voting Rights Act, which makes it illegal to gerrymander districts in a racially discriminatory way. This provision has stopped Republican-controlled states from eliminating representation for Black Americans in southern states, and this is what the civil rights movement fought for. But now this part of the VRA, which again bans racist gerrymandering, might actually be struck down because, and this is not a joke, conservatives are arguing that it's racist against white people. In other words, not being able to discriminate against Black people is tantamount to racism against white people. Now, I'll admit that's an oversimplification of their legal argument, but that's what it comes down to, right? They want to be able to discriminate against Black people and gerrymander their representation away, dilute their voting power, and if they can't do that, they think that that's unfair to them. But let me give you some additional context here so you understand what they're talking about here. So as Stephen Prager of Common Dreams writes, the origins of the case itself are highly unusual. It began typically enough with a conservative Fifth Circuit court affirming a lower court's ruling that the congressional maps drawn by Louisiana's GOP in 2022 constituted an illegal racial gerrymander. Despite Black residents making up roughly a third of Louisiana's population, many of them were crammed into a single district, while the other 5 in the state remained majority white. After the court ruling, Republican Governor Jeff Landry convened an emergency legislative session to draw new maps that complied with the court's order and granted another majority Black district. But shortly after the map was finalized, it was challenged by a group of white voters who alleged that by drawing new maps that gave Black voters fairer representation, Louisiana's legislature was effectively enacting an illegal racial gerrymander against voters who are not Black. And this is so diabolical because they're basically using Section 2 against itself to destroy Section 2. Now, it's bizarre that the court even decided to take up this case, seeing as how they just rejected this same argument back in 2022 in Allen v. Milligan, and Section 2 of the VRA was upheld. So it's reasonable to assume based on that case that this case would go the same way, right? The problem is that things are fundamentally different this time. And the thing that's different is Brett Kavanaugh. So in 2022, he voted to uphold Section 2, but released a concurring opinion where he agreed with something that Clarence Thomas said in his dissenting opinion. And Clarence Thomas basically argued that these bans against discrimination, they can't go on indefinitely. They have to expire at some point. And even though Kavanaugh at the time thought that it was necessary to uphold Section 2, he still telegraphed his agreement with Thomas that it should be taken away at some point. And it seems like the time to take away Section 2 has now come, just 3 years later for Kavanaugh. Politico reports Justice Brett Kavanaugh, whose vote will likely be pivotal in the case, repeatedly suggested that race-based remedies under the Voting Rights Act should be permitted only for a limited period of time. They should have an endpoint, Kavanaugh said during the oral arguments, which stretched for about 2.5 hours. Now, compared to the other conservative justices who Politico described as outright hostile towards Section 2, which is crazy, Kavanaugh isn't necessarily hostile towards it. He just stupidly believes that racism in politics, I guess, has been solved, even though just a couple of years ago, he agreed that Section 2 was necessary to stop Republicans from racially discriminating against Black people in their states. But I mean, the reason why he's so important and all the attention is focused on him is because if he flips, it becomes 5-4 in the other direction, which means they then have the majority to gut the Voting Rights Act, basically give it its final death blow, which means that the Supreme Court, if they did this, would effectively legalize electoral racial discrimination once again. Now, this to me is horrifying to think about, and you can only, catastrophize so much, but I want to go to an analysis by Max Flugrath of Slate, where he lays out what this is going to mean in practice. He writes, combined with Donald Trump and Republicans' ongoing gerrymandering power grab, gutting Section 2 could help secure an additional 27 safe GOP U.S. seats, at least 19 directly tied to the loss of Section 2. According to a new analysis from Fair Fight Action and Black Voters Matter Fund, it's enough to cement one-party control of the House for at least a generation. The result would essentially be a return to the pre-1965 Jim Crow playbook masked in pseudo-constitutional language. If Section 2 falls, we could see an existential shift in power, a system in which representation reflects not the will of the people, but the will of those in power. Congress would become insulated from accountability, its makeup preserved by maps drawn to protect incumbents. Remember, Trump won the 2024 election by just 2.2 million votes out of more than 155 million cast. This is how democracies erode, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, deliberately, and often quietly by design. The VRA was passed to stop those in power from deciding who gets to have a voice and who doesn't. If the court removes that protection, it will hand the Trump regime and its allies a powerful tool to permanently weaken fair representation, tighten their grip on power, and drag the country further into authoritarian rule. Without Section 2, Americans would be left with a hollow shell of democracy, elections that appear free but are rigged to keep power in the same hands. Protecting the independence of our elections is the only way to halt that slide away from freedom. Now, additionally, with regard to the specific impact this will have on Black and brown people, Fair Fight Action and Black Voters Matter estimate in their report that 30% of Congressional Black Caucus members and 11% of Congressional Hispanic Caucus members are going to lose their seats because of this. So, little by little, our new authoritarian status quo is really starting to take shape. And I don't like what that looks like. It looks like a competitive authoritarian regime where elections are merely a way for our Republican rulers to do performative democracy, but elections just will by no means facilitate meaningful changes in power, which is antithetical to democracy. I mean, elections happen in every single regime, even totalitarian ones. They just are there for a show. And that's what American democracies are slowly but surely turning into. Black Americans will be legal second-class citizens once again with no representation. Ideological opponents will be intimidated and punished for challenging the regime. And information itself will be suppressed and controlled by the ruling party's oligarchs. This is what we have in store. But I will say that as bleak as it looks, there are things that can be done to push back against this blatant power grab. Max Flugrath, for example, recommends that every single Democratic state aggressively gerrymander as many seats away from Republicans as they possibly can. To counter what they're doing, you have to fight fire with fire. But unfortunately, I don't think Democrats are up for the task. I just don't think they're willing to do that, aside from Gavin Newsom, as flawed as he may be. But I mean, if you have a seat that you can gerrymander away from a Republican, you have to do that now. Most Democratic-controlled states aren't doing that. But I mean, if the Supreme Court really does do what it looks like they're going to do and turns America into a one-party state, we're going to have to get creative, right? We may need to infiltrate the Republican Party and have leftists and progressives run as Republicans, right? They may start to tighten eligibility criteria as a result of that. But I mean, you got to start like thinking outside of the box, because it's clear that democracy isn't just going to be restored automatically by us waiting out the clock and hoping and praying that Trump leaves office in 2028. There has to be a robust movement driven by working class people of all colors and stripes to take power back from the fascists, because you can't just assume that things are going to go back to normal at some point on their own. Not that, normal was good to begin with. And I think that normal is what facilitated the rise of authoritarianism. But I mean, things aren't going to change for the better automatically. I think that we have to come to terms with the fact that that ship has sailed and democracy is already dead. But having said that, as tight as their grip on power may be, and as powerful as their propaganda is, authoritarianism doesn't have to be permanent. Most people around the world, they live in some kind of authoritarian regime. It's not just us. And even the most repressive dictatorships cannot withstand pressure from mass mobilization. Sure, they might try to suppress it, but it doesn't take much to spark an entire mass movement. So whether or not our bout with authoritarianism will be permanent or just a phase is going to hinge on whether or not we choose to give up. And it's easy to just see this news and want to check out. But you have to understand that things have always been very difficult in America. I'd argue that indigenous people and women, as well as civil rights leaders from the 60s and LGBTQ plus leaders, were up against far worse than what we're up against now, as bad as things are. But they never gave up. And I feel like if they didn't give up and they fought for our future, we can't give up. And we have to fight for the future, right? The next generation. You got to basically channel your frustration into something productive rather than checking out, because change is only going to become impossible once we all stop trying. And I know that that sounds corny, believe me, but it's true. You cannot give up. You have to do something to make a difference. That means organizing, meeting with people locally, canvassing, getting involved politically. Checking out is exactly what they want. But putting that aside, it's bleak right now. And it may get even worse. So it looks like the Supreme Court is going to do the unthinkable. And if they do, we're going to be in very, very bad shape, to put it mildly.
Do yourself a favor and click the join button on YouTube to become a member. Because Mike's doing a great job getting to watch his videos before everyone else is tremendous. Many people are saying this. Join today, folks. You won't regret it.